Today on CodeDependent, I'm going to talk about event performance, timer performance, mouse event performance, and animation performance. So someone asked a question on my blog about how to do a particular thing, and they had tried using timer, and it looked really awful, or they were using mouse events. I'm not sure which, but they said, oh, and then I used the effect stuff, and it ran a lot smoother. And that was great to hear because, you know, we worked on things to make things smooth and functional in general. But I think the problem they were running into actually wasn't about using timer directly and doing something that, you know, we do awfully clever inside effects. Instead, it was about using updateAfterEvent. So it's important to know how to deal with faster event performance and faster rendering performance when you're dealing with very dynamic actions, such as tracking mouse movement or running animations. So we'll take a look at a couple of examples of that. So let's run this application, and there's two things going on in this application. One is that I have this red ball that wants to follow the mouse movement. So wherever the mouse is, it wants to paint itself there. Right? So as I move the mouse around, the ball is adjusting its movement, its position, so that it can be where the mouse is. Not really terribly useful, but demonstrating a point here. Right? Now notice as I drag the mouse around, yeah, the ball is actually tracking the mouse, but really not very well. Right? It's incredibly slow. And one of the reasons is that I actually set an abnormally slow frame rate. By default, Flex applications have a frame rate of 24, so it'll be updating itself 24 times a second instead of 2, which is a really awful frame rate. So we're obviously getting a horrible frame rate for updating. But there's another element here that we'll see as well. Similarly, I want to move this button. I want to animate it, so when I click on the button, it's going to animate to move from the left to the right. So we can see here, you move on the button. We're going to call this start timer thing, and then start timer is going to create a timer object with callback of 10 milliseconds. So this is the same delay that we have on the timer that runs internally in our animation class that the effects use in Flex 4. Then it's going to add an event listener of the timer handler so that as these 10 millisecond periods elapse, it's going to call our handler. And we're going to start the timer going. And we're going to record the start time. And then when the timer handler gets called, we're going to say, OK, how much time has passed between the current time and whenever we started the animation? And after the end of a second, we're going to go ahead and stop the timer. So we're going to basically run an animation that lasts for a second. And otherwise, if the elapsed period of a second hasn't finished, then we're going to set the value of the button, the X value of the button, to be a position between the starting position on the left and the ending position on the right. So fairly simple animation that moves the button from the left to the right. We click on the button and it moves in a really horrible way. Right? Look at how choppy that animation is. Okay? And again, that's being affected by the frame rate here, right? Because we're only updating the screen 2 frames a second. So what can we do to improve this? So what we need to do is add something called updateAfterEvent. So let's quit this. Let's make another attempt here. Let's say, OK, for the mouse move handler, after I set the position of this thing, this ellipse that's going to be tracking the position of the mouse, then I'm going to call event.updateAfterEvent. Now let's go ahead and run the application. Now check it out. I move the mouse around, and that ugly red circle is following the mouse wherever I move. So what's happening is that we're getting these calls very frequently in, and we're setting the position of the object of our circle, setting the position of the circle so that it's the mouse location, but we don't actually render the result immediately. Instead, we wait till the next update, and then we draw the position of the cursor. But if the mouse has moved since then we're basically drawing an obsolete position, right? So the mouse moves here, we get a call into our handler, we calculate the position of the circle, and then the mouse moves elsewhere, and by the time we actually update the screen, what you see is this, even though the mouse is way over here. Right? So what we want to do instead is actually render immediately, and that's what updateEvent does. It says, OK, I've changed some values. I think it's time to actually render a frame here, no matter what the frame rate is. Even if we only want to run at 2 frames a second, it's still important to run at a faster frame rate, in particular in the situations where we need faster updates because of this dynamic information. So here, we're getting obviously way more than 2 frames a second because we're forcing an update event. We're forcing another frame to be rendered, specifically when the mouse position changes and we change the position of our circle. Similarly, we have this horrible button animation where it doesn't update very often. Well, we can go in here and say, in our timer handler routine, we can say event.updateAfterEvent for that as well. Run the application again. Click the button. and voila, we get a much faster animation. Now, it's still actually limited there a little bit because it's being artificially limited by the frame rate. So if I actually set this to the default value of 24, we'll get an even smoother animation. So we can get a much faster animation simply by forcing an update event, but it's still capped at some value because Flash is sort of abnormally saying, well, don't render too often. So by default, you're going to get 24 frames a second anyway, and you're not going to see the kinds of artifacts that we saw in the application to begin with so egregiously. But in very fast movements like mouse movement, it's important to update the screen probably more often than 24 frames a second, specifically because this kind of artifact. Right? You simply can't keep up with the dynamic motion of the mouse fast enough if you're only rendering 24 frames a second. So update after event, specifically for mouse events and timer events, if you happen to be using timer directly, and hopefully your animation and user interaction performance will be better. If you want to check out the code for this application and other related applications, go to my blog at graphics-geek.blogspot.com.